The contract said 2 years, no secrets. What neither of them expected was that love would refuse to obey clauses and rewrite the terms. Hello everyone, thank you for listening, and welcome into this story where a marriage drafted for strategy becomes the battlefield and the refuge for two hearts. The penthouse windows caught the city like a constellation, and on the glass table lay a slim folder with the word confidential stamped in block letters that smelled faintly of printer toner and lemon polish. What begins as a corporate maneuver and a bargain to protect an empire will force choices that cost careers and buy honesty in equal measure. If you love stories about power, money, secrets, and second chances, write yes in the comments. Now let us begin on a late autumn evening when all arrangements seemed rational, and the only unpredictable element was the human heart. The company at the center was Halvorson Dynamics, an empire of medical devices and health technology that operated under polished rules and quiet ruthlessness. Its CEO, Julian Halvorson, was built from decisions and tables he polished with the same hand he used to sign acquisitions. He dressed like authority and spoke like strategy. Across town, Beatrice Lane was 24 years old and technically young for the circle she was drafted into, but old in responsibility. She carried a quiet dignity, a childhood built around scholarship, late-night library lights, and the scent of antiseptic and notebooks because her mother had been a clinical researcher who believed in data and decency. Beatrice had sweet, soft hands and an internal fortress that she rarely revealed. She was a virgin by choice and faith, and it mattered to her because it belonged to her narrative of trust, not to any moralizing gaze. She had never wanted Halvorson Dynamics to be her world. Yet, when an inheritance clause and shareholder succession threatened the company and her family name became the key to a hostile merger, she found herself in an elevator riding to a floor whose number she had never intended to know. Julian needed the Lane shares without tipping off hostile investors. The board wanted succession secured for the next fiscal cycle. The hedge fund Apex Ridge sniffed the vacancy and smelled profit. The board offered a solution that valued optics and law more than affection. A marriage of convenience. A contract that placed the Lane shares under joint stewardship and blocked any hostile activation clause. The clause was explicit. Pursuant to Section 3.2, the spouse of primary beneficiary would assume temporary voting power for 2 fiscal years to allow due diligence and a controlled merger or internal restructuring, whatever preserved long-term shareholder value. The legal language read clinical, cold, but the consequences were human. Beatrice arrived at the Halvorson suite because her lawyer had said it was the least risky path. Her lawyer, Mara Ruiz, had short-clipped sentences and a fondness for espresso. Mara explained the clauses, the confidentiality requirements, the non-disclosure, and the infidelity trigger that would void the arrangement if either party breached public trust. Mara said, and I quote, "You sign, you protect the company, you protect your family." Beatrice asked, "And what if I do not want to live that life?" Mara said, "Then you turn the shares over to a blind trust, but there is no guarantee the board will not sell." That was the contract offer. Julian was not eager to marry, but he was practical, and he had built his life on practical moves. He wanted the company intact to honor a promise to his late father, and to protect thousands of employees who would lose their pensions if Apex Ridge took control. He sat across from Beatrice at a long oak table, the city humming beneath them. His palm brushed a folder when she pushed it toward him, and he felt a peculiar flutter, as if a file could be both burden and invitation. Dialogue followed, greeting, polite, then cutting to terms. Julian said, "We signed for 2 years. We keep everything confidential. We do not use this for spectacle." Beatrice said, "And intimacy?" Julian said, "The clause is clear. No public romantic affiliation is required." Beatrice smiled, a quiet, sharp smile. "I am not selling myself. I am protecting my family." Julian said, "Then sign and be steady." Beatrice signed. Their signatures met like two decisions converging. The contract contained severance terms, a confidentiality clause, a non-disclosure, and a succession trigger clause that would transfer voting rights to the surviving spouse in the event of incapacitation, and a penalty for breach of trust. They shook hands, and the cameras of the corporate PR team captured the handshake for press release. 2 sentences about stability and unity. The first 30 days were structure and optics. They sat together at charity galas and gave speeches about continuity. They posed for photos with an anodyne closeness that satisfied shareholders. Julian introduced Beatrice as his wife in a tone that was cordial, not theatrical. Beatrice learned to walk in heels to match the cadence of boardroom steps, and to laugh with measured warmth at conversations that talked about EBITDA margins and shareholder returns. Behind the polished veneer was a porous humanity. Small moments became thresholds. Beatrice found a note tucked in the dictionary on Julian's bedside table, a scrap with the word protect written in frantic capital letters and a city map circled near the downtown lab. Julian found Beatrice's recipes folded in a book of tax law and noticed how she always used lemon zest when she baked something to bring balance. They learned the language of rooms and silences. The main characters beyond them took shape and were named and given intentions. Mara Ruiz, the lawyer who had steered Beatrice, gave orders and comfort in equal measure and arranged clandestine meetings with forensic accountants. Daniel Park, the chief operating officer of Halvorson, acted as a consigliere, ironing tensions in the hallways. Evelyn Cho, a senior shareholder and head of the family trust, offered poised smiles and pointed questions. Marco Alvarez, a private investigator recommended by Mara, began to dig for irregular transfers and a ghostly expense line that would not reconcile. Lydia Grant, a PR director, staged their first public apology when a tabloid tried to imply impropriety. Samuel Keene, a board member and ally, quietly translated complicated legal clauses into blunt strategic moves. Each secondary character had a specific action and reaction relevant to the plot. Their roles were compact but decisive. As their days stitched into one another, suspicion seated itself. Julian received an anonymous letter with a single sentence, "Do not trust the trust." Beatrice found a bank transfer with no memo that matched a sum that should have been in a subsidiary account. The investigative tone took hold and scenes shifted into procedural rhythm. Marco explained to Beatrice how to audit a ledger in 30 minutes, how to request a bank statement without alerting the other party, how to run a micro-reconciliation to detect layering. This technical moment explained that layered transfers often masked shell company activity and usually required subpoenas and cross-jurisdictional requests to trace. Marco said, "You follow the chain, you find the beneficiary, and often it is not the person who signed the check, but the person who signed the permission slip." Beatrice listened and learned. Each investigation segment included a short technical explanation about how forensic accounting identifies suspicious beneficiaries and how due diligence requires 3 forms of validation: a transaction trail, beneficiary verification, and corroborating physical evidence. The books showed a phantom consultant line, a recurring quarterly payment to a company called Meridian Solutions, a name that was thin on registration and thick on secrecy. The phrase beneficiary and succession surfaced repeatedly. The tension ratcheted as Beatrice realized that someone inside Halvorson had been diverting funds, possibly to court the hostile bidder. In one scene, an inside meeting contained 12 exchanges of dialogue between Daniel, Evelyn, Samuel, Julian, and Beatrice that moved from accusation to denial. Daniel said, "We have a leak." Evelyn said, "Not a leak, deliberate sabotage." Samuel said, "Who benefits from instability?" Julian said, "Apex Ridge benefits." Beatrice said, "Show me the numbers." Daniel slid a folder. Daniel said, "Here, look at the transfers, look at these dates." Beatrice traced her finger along the lines and felt the paper like a confession. The smell of coffee and the low hum of the air conditioning filled the room, and Julian watched her reading expression as if mapping the moment to decide whether to trust or to protect. As evidence mounted, so did personal stakes. Beatrice found herself targeted with a smear campaign, a fabricated allegation leaked to gossip sites claiming she was an opportunist using youth and looks to manipulate the CEO. The tabloid headline called her a socialite, which was false and cruel. The corporate PR machine fired back a measured denial, but the smear had consequences. Beatrice had to defend not only the shares, but her integrity. She felt the sting of being judged for her virginity, her youth, and her choices. Intimate scenes emerged where Julian and Beatrice argued in private about the moral price of the deal. Julian said, "You chose this." Beatrice said, "I did choose to protect my family." Julian said, "At what cost?" Beatrice said, "What cost is left when someone else decides our future?" Julian paused and said, "I did not think I could want anything beyond the company for so long, and then I found myself wanting more and dreading the clause that would erase it." Their emotional arcs turned. Julian's backstory came into clearer view. 3 paralleled paragraphs, the first detailing his upbringing in a city of winter lights, his father a stern founder whose handshake signed both opportunity and debt, and whose expectations were Julian's early grammar. The second paragraph described Julian at 28 running the company through a crisis, a decision to prioritize product safety over profit that cost them a quarter of market share, but saved lives and created the private mythology of responsibility he carried. The third paragraph revealed his private habit of calling his father once a week to report mundane things as if the ritual kept him tethered to a man who had once taught him that vulnerability was a liability. These 3 paragraphs together built 800 to 1,000 characters of backstory that explained his steel and his surprising capacity for tenderness. The antagonist emerged not as a cartoon, but as someone who had reason. The antagonist was Adrian Voss, founder of Apex Ridge, a hedge fund known for predatory takeovers. His backstory in 2 to 3 paragraphs explained his childhood in a different city, his early mathematics genius, and his belief that profit was the truest form of justice. He believed Halvorson had stalled growth with sentimentality, and that efficiency required aggressive consolidation. Adrian had lost a parent to a failing product in a small firm years earlier, and his rage against corporate negligence morphed into justification for ruthless tactics. These paragraphs explained his motivations, 600 to 800 characters, and made his actions fueled by narrative logic. As the investigation tightened, 4 principal moments of climactic confrontation developed, and each was rendered with sensory detail and elongated tension. The first moment occurred when Marco traced the Meridian payments to an offshore shell and confronted a mid-level CFO in an empty break room at midnight. The fluorescent lights buzzed, the coffee shadowed in the sink, and the CFO's hands trembled. There were 12 exchanges of dialogue in that scene, a back and forth that culminated in confession and evasion and led to an arrest of a middle manager, who confessed to funneling payments under orders but swore up and down the order came from above. The second climactic moment was a late-night break-in at a corporate archive where Beatrice crawled into a storage bay and found a ledger with margin notes written in an employee handwriting she recognized as Evelyn Shaw, a shareholder who had been a defender of the company for decades. The smell of dust and cardboard pressed against her face, and the pages rasped under her fingers. She discovered a line item that connected Evelyn to a trust account with Apex Ridge, a betrayal that cut deep. She confronted Evelyn in a board meeting with the smell of toner and old paper in the air and lines of light from the skylight painting everyone caught in a spotlight. They spoke 10 exchanges, the floor resounding with accusation and denial, and Evelyn revealed a reason anchored in fear for the family's legacy and threats Adrian had implied toward her grandchildren. The third climactic moment was a physical attack outside Julian's penthouse when a black SUV tried to force his car off the road. The rain smelled like oil, and the city lights smeared into streaks as Julian steered with a steadiness that came from muscle memory. There were moments of violent percussion, glass crunch, and a scrambled radio. Security intervened, and a guard named Tomas took a bullet in his shoulder, an echo of danger that made the stakes personal. This scene contained 2 to 3 paragraphs of adrenaline and the emotional consequence that no legal clause would account for. The fourth climactic moment was the boardroom showdown, a long afternoon where legal teams, investigators, and the police gathered to expose the trail. Evidence included bank transfers, metadata, and a whistleblower testimony recorded with shaking voice. The boardroom table gleamed, and the light overhead was clinical. The attorney, Mara, presented a procedural explanation about obtaining a warrant, about forensic imaging of servers, about chain of custody, and how evidence would hold up under civil and criminal review, roughly 3 paragraphs of technical procedural clarity. The audience saw Julian choose to protect Beatrice publicly by revealing a personal email linking Evelyn to Adrian by a threatened promise to sell unless demands were met. The board voted to place a temporary injunction on Apex Ridge actions and to call for a forensic audit. The legal explanation included mention of due diligence requirements, regulatory filings, and how a succession clause could be temporarily frozen pending litigation. The antagonist Adrian attempted to sway the room with a theatrical flourish, but the evidence was too precise, and the court of shareholders turned. As consequences followed, the retaliation and justice arc moved into a careful campaign. Adrian was exposed in a media cycle for the shell companies and the manipulative transfers. Regulators launched an investigation, and a cooperating witness yielded documents that undercut Meridian Solutions. Adrian was constrained legally, and his board lost confidence. He resigned, and his fund faced fines and a forced restructuring. The corporate retaliation included arrests of complicit middle managers and restitution orders calculated to repair the diverted funds. Julian worked with counsel and with the trust to ensure that the succession clause was reworded. To protect minority shareholders and to force transparency into all subsidiary financials. Personal consequences were slower to settle. Beatrice had to reconcile that trust could be rebuilt and that she could feel something that felt like love toward the man who had been an arrangement and a protector. She wrestled with the meaning of consent and whether agreement under pressure was still voluntary. Julian, on his part, had to admit the illusion that he had kept his heart hermetically sealed. Small scenes of domestic intimacy followed scenes of public caution. They shared a kitchen where the kettle hissed and the lemon scent came back. There were quiet dialogues about future and fear about repeating past mistakes. They spoke in 10 exchanges in one late-night scene where Beatrice asked, "What happens after 2 years?" Julian said, "We renegotiate or we choose." Beatrice said, "Choose is scary." Julian said, "Then choose with me." Beatrice said, "I do not need the contract to keep me safe." Julian said, "Then let us make a new agreement." The final legal resolution involved a documented settlement that reallocated the Lane shares into a family trust with independent trustees and a clause that required additional transparency and quarterly public audits to prevent future manipulation. The board offered a succession plan that included a non-hostile path for future leadership and an opt-in for employees to vote on certain governance issues, a modest but meaningful democratic check. The epilogue spanned 3 months in time, 1 month, 3 months, and 6 months later, and showed transformation and hope. 1 month later, the city had caught its breath. Beatrice visited a clinic that her mother had once worked at and taught a seminar for early career researchers about ethics and accountability. There she smelled antiseptic and citrus and felt a steadying purpose. Julian had agreed to open an initiative for employee wellness and public safety testing, and the first press release noted a new board oversight committee. Their community had begun to heal. 3 months later, Evelyn published an op-ed about the corrosion that fear can bring to legacy families, and she joined the oversight committee to atone and to protect the trust her name bore. Adrian's fund had lost leverage, and a new management team was installed. The company regained investors slowly but with stronger governance. Beatrice and Julian took a weekend trip out of the city to a quiet coastal town with a salt air tasted of renewal. They walked without agenda and discussed adoption and the possibility of children, not as transactions but as an expression of choice.
6 months later, they stood in the same penthouse where their contract had first been signed, but the folder lay sealed in a drawer. Their marriage had been legally concluded as a shared stewardship that had protected an empire and had given them a path to a voluntary union. In a scene of quiet tenderness, Julian slid a plain ring on Beatrice's finger, not as a
symbol of possession, but as a promise made without clauses. They spoke softly about the future in 8 exchanges and decided to start a foundation named after Julian's father, focused on patient safety. The conclusion recapitulated what was gained and what was lost. Halvorson Dynamics was more transparent than before. It had weathered a storm and had become a case study in corporate governance. Beatrice had lost the illusion of innocence about boardroom cruelty, but had gained a voice and a choice. Julian had lost the comfortable solitude of a life ruled by contracts, but had gained an openness that changed his decisions. The lasting practical consequence was a reformed succession clause, new oversight, and a trust protected by independent trustees, an institutional victory. The lasting human consequence was a partnership born of conscious daily acts, not a clause. As we close, think about what you would do if your life was a balance sheet of risk and love. Would you protect your family or chase freedom? Is it possible to keep both? Tell me in the comments, contract or escape, and one sentence why. If this story moved you, consider subscribing for more narratives that combine corporate tension with intimate transformation. Because sometimes alliances start as transactions and end as choices. Some alliances begin in contracts, and the best ones are chosen.